The classified ad had been running for months. $80,000 per year. Private driver needed, no questions asked. Nobody wanted the job. But one rainy morning, Samuel Carter, drowning in debt and grief, dialed the number. Minutes later, he stood before the Whitmore mansion, its silent windows staring back like witnesses. The butler whispered, "She's been waiting for you." When Samuel stepped inside, he felt it instantly, an invisible grief clinging to every wall. Did he really know what he was about to walk into? Keep watching, because this emotional real-life story of a broken single dad and a grieving millionaire will restore your faith in humanity and leave you sobbing happy tears by the end. You won't believe how one impossible job changed 3 lives forever. Samuel Carter had stopped believing in fresh starts 3 years ago. That was when Laura died in their bedroom while he held her hand, whispering promises he knew he couldn't keep. The cancer had taken her quickly, and the medical bills had taken everything else. What remained was a 1-bedroom apartment with peeling wallpaper, a daughter who hadn't spoken more than 10 words in 2 years, and a stack of overdue notices that grew taller every month. Grace was 7 now. She had Laura's dark hair and quiet eyes, but none of her mother's warmth. At school, teachers called her withdrawn. At home, she sat by the window and drew pictures of empty houses. Samuel tried everything. Therapy they couldn't afford. Gentle questions she wouldn't answer. Toys she ignored. Nothing worked. The silence between them had become its own language, one Samuel didn't know how to translate. The ad appeared in the back of the newspaper on a Tuesday morning. Samuel almost missed it. Buried between listings for warehouse workers and security guards. $80,000 per year. Private driver needed. No questions asked? He read it 3 times, certain it was a mistake or a scam. Nobody paid that much for a driver. Nobody. But desperation had a way of making impossibilities seem reasonable. Samuel called the number from a pay phone outside the grocery store. A man answered on the first ring, his voice clipped and formal. "Whitmore residence." Samuel cleared his throat. "I'm calling about the driver position." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then the man said, "Can you be here in an hour?" "I don't even know where." 42 Rosewood Hill, North Side, the Black Gate." The line went dead. Samuel stood there holding the receiver, rain beginning to tap against the glass. 42 Rosewood Hill. He knew the neighborhood by reputation only: old money, mansions hidden behind iron gates and hedges tall enough to block out the world. People who lived there didn't advertise for help in newspapers. They used agencies, connections, referrals from other wealthy families. But Samuel was out of options. The rent was 3 weeks overdue. Grace needed new shoes. The electricity had been threatened twice. He hung up the phone and walked back to the apartment where Grace sat coloring at the kitchen table. She didn't look up when he entered. "I have to go somewhere," Samuel said softly. "Mrs. Chen from downstairs will watch you for a bit." Grace's crayon stopped moving. She stared at the paper but didn't respond. Samuel knelt beside her chair. "I'll be back soon, I promise." She resumed coloring as if he hadn't spoken. The drive to Rosewood Hill took 20 minutes in his rusted sedan. The rain grew heavier, turning the streets into rivers of gray. When he reached the address, Samuel almost turned back. The mansion rose behind a black iron gate like something from another century. 3 stories of stone and dark windows. Ivy crawled up the walls. The lawn stretched wide and empty, perfectly maintained, but lifeless. Samuel pressed the intercom button. The gate buzzed open without a word. He parked in the circular driveway and stepped out into the rain. Before he reached the front door, it opened. An elderly man stood in the doorway, dressed in a black suit that looked older than Samuel. His face was lined and weary, like someone who had witnessed too much and forgotten how to look away. "Mr. Carter," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. I'm Arthur. Come in." The interior of the mansion was colder than the rain outside. High ceilings, dark wood floors, furniture that looked expensive and unused. Everything was perfectly arranged, but there was no warmth to it. No photographs on the walls, no personal touches, just silence and space. Arthur led him down a long hallway. Their footsteps echoed. The position is simple, Arthur said without turning around. You drive Mrs. Whitmore to 4 locations every day, 8:30 in the morning. The route never changes. You wait, you drive her back. You don't ask questions. That's it? Samuel asked. That's it. Why doesn't anyone want the job? Arthur stopped walking. He turned to face Samuel, and for the first time his expression softened into something like pity. Because Mrs. Whitmore doesn't speak. She doesn't explain. And she goes to places that will break your heart if you let them. Before Samuel could ask what that meant, Arthur pushed open a door. The study was darker than the hallway. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light. A woman sat behind a massive desk, her back straight, her hands folded on the surface. She was younger than Samuel expected, maybe 40, maybe less. Beautiful in a way that felt deliberate and cold. Her blonde hair was pulled back. Her suit was black. Her eyes were empty. Margaret Whitmore didn't stand when they entered. She studied Samuel the way someone might study a piece of furniture they were considering buying. You have a daughter, she said finally. Her voice was flat, drained of feeling. Samuel blinked. Yes. How old? 7. Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She looked away toward the darkened window. You'll start tomorrow. 8:30. Arthur will show you the car. I thank you. I won't let you down. Margaret didn't respond. She had already dismissed him, her attention returning to papers on her desk that Samuel suspected she wasn't really reading. Arthur escorted him back through the hallway. At the door, the old man placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. A word of advice, Arthur said quietly. Don't try to fix her. Don't try to understand. Just drive. Samuel wanted to ask more, but Arthur had already closed the door. The first morning, Samuel arrived 10 minutes early. The car was a black sedan, spotless and silent. Margaret appeared at exactly 8:30, wearing the same expression she'd worn in the study, blank, distant, untouchable. She slid into the back seat without a word. Where to? Samuel asked. The hospital. Samuel drove. Margaret stared out the window. When they reached the Children's Hospital on Clearwater Avenue, she didn't get out. She simply sat in the parking lot for 30 minutes, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the entrance. Samuel watched her in the rearview mirror. She didn't move, didn't cry, didn't do anything, just sat. After exactly 30 minutes, she said, Next location. The second stop was a law office downtown. Margaret went inside for 15 minutes, and came out with red-rimmed eyes and a harder expression. She didn't speak on the way to the third location. The third stop was the strangest. An empty lot on the edge of town. Nothing there but a concrete foundation and weeds. Margaret stood beside the car and stared at it for 30 minutes. Samuel didn't understand. There was nothing to see, just broken ground and the ghost of something that was never built. The fourth stop was a bank. Margaret went inside. Samuel waited. When she returned, her face was a mask again. Home, she said. They didn't speak the entire drive back. This became the routine every day. 4 stops, 30 minutes each. No explanations, no conversation, just silence and grief so thick Samuel could feel it pressing against the windows. Grace asked about the job once in her own way. She drew a picture of a black car and left it on the kitchen table. Samuel stared at it for a long time, unsure what it meant. 2 weeks into the job, Grace got sick. A fever that spiked overnight and wouldn't break. Samuel called Arthur in a panic. I can't leave her alone. I need to bring her with me. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Arthur said, Bring her. Samuel carried Grace to the car wrapped in a blanket. She was small and quiet, her face flushed with fever. Margaret was already in the back seat. When she saw Grace, something flickered across her face, shock maybe, or recognition. Her mouth opened slightly, her hands tightened in her lap. Samuel placed Grace in the front passenger seat and started driving. In the rearview mirror, he saw Margaret staring at his daughter. Not with coldness, not with distance, with something raw and unguarded. At the hospital parking lot, Margaret didn't stare at the entrance. She stared at Grace. At the law office, she glanced back at the car twice. At the empty foundation, she stood closer to the vehicle than usual. At the bank, she returned faster. On the drive home, Margaret spoke for the first time in 2 weeks. "What's her name?" Samuel glanced in the mirror. "Grace." Margaret's lips pressed together. She looked out the window and Samuel thought he saw her hand move toward her face, toward tears she refused to let fall. When they arrived at the mansion, Margaret didn't get out immediately. She sat there staring at the back of Grace's head. "Bring her tomorrow," Margaret said quietly. "If she's still sick." Samuel didn't know what to say. He nodded. Margaret stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. At the door, she stopped and turned back just for a moment. She looked at Grace again, and then she was gone. That night, Grace's fever broke. But something else had broken too, something in the air between Samuel and the woman who hired him. A crack in the ice, small, barely visible. But there. Grace recovered. But Margaret's request lingered in Samuel's mind like an unanswered question. The next morning, he arrived alone. Margaret entered the car and said nothing about the empty front seat, but something had shifted. The silence between them felt different now, less like a wall and more like a held breath. The routine continued: hospital parking lot, law office, empty foundation, bank. 30 minutes each. No explanations. But now Margaret occasionally glanced toward the front seat where Grace had been, as if checking whether the girl had reappeared. Samuel began to notice things he'd missed before. The way Margaret's hands trembled slightly when they pulled into the hospital lot. The way her breathing changed at the foundation site, shallow, controlled, like someone trying not to drown. The way she always looked smaller when she returned from the law office, as if the building had taken something from her. He understood grief. He'd lived inside it for 3 years, knew its weight and texture, recognized it in the set of her shoulders, the careful blankness of her face. Margaret Whitmore was drowning in the same water that had nearly killed him. But understanding didn't mean speaking. Arthur's warning echoed every time Samuel thought about asking a question. "Don't try to fix her. Just drive." 3 weeks after Grace's fever, Samuel found Arthur in the mansion's kitchen. The old man was polishing silver that already gleamed, his movements slow and methodical. "Can I ask you something?" Samuel said. Arthur didn't look up. "You can ask. The 4 places we go every day. What are they?" Arthur set down the cloth. He looked at Samuel. "The hospital is where her son was born. The law office is where she signed the papers to have him put away. The foundation is where she was building him a house before he died. And the bank is where she set up his trust fund that he never lived to use." The words landed like stones in water. Samuel felt them sink. How did he die? Overdose. 2 years ago. He was 23. Arthur picked up the cloth. Resumed polishing. The conversation was over. That night, Samuel held Grace while she slept. She'd fallen asleep on the couch watching cartoons, her small body curled against his side. He thought about Margaret sitting in that parking lot every morning, staring at the place where her son had entered the world. Thought about the foundation of a house that would never be built. About a mother signing papers to lock away her own child because addiction had made him a stranger. He thought about Laura in those final weeks, how she'd made him promise to take care of Grace, to make sure their daughter never forgot her, how impossible that promise had felt. Still felt. Samuel carried Grace to bed and tucked the blanket around her. She stirred slightly, made a small sound, but didn't wake. He stood there watching her breathe, this silent child who carried her own grief in ways he couldn't reach. Maybe Arthur was right. Maybe some things couldn't be fixed. Maybe all you could do was drive. But the next morning when Margaret settled into the back seat and they pulled away from the mansion, Samuel found himself speaking anyway. My wife died 3 years ago. The words came out before he could stop them. In the rearview mirror, Margaret's eyes lifted to meet his. Cancer. Samuel continued. Grace hasn't really talked since. Not to me. Not to anyone. Margaret looked away, back toward her window. Samuel thought he made a mistake, crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. My son's name was Michael. Samuel's hands tightened on the wheel. He waited, but Margaret said nothing more. They drove to the hospital in silence, but it was a different silence now, not empty, full. Over the following days, Margaret began to speak in small fragments. Never much, never directly, but words appeared like cracks in ice, letting something through. At the law office, she said, I put him in rehab 4 times. He hated me for it. At the foundation, she said, he wanted to be an architect. I was building this for him, a place to start over. At the bank, she said, I thought money could save him. I was wrong about everything. Samuel never responded with advice or comfort. He just listened. And slowly, Margaret's 30-minute visits began to feel less like punishment and more like ritual, a way of keeping Michael alive, of refusing to let him become nothing. One afternoon, after they returned to the mansion, Margaret didn't immediately leave the car. She sat in the back seat, staring at her hands. Do you ever feel like you failed them? She asked. Samuel turned in his seat to face her. Every day. Margaret's eyes were wet, but no tears fell. I had all the resources in the world, the best doctors, the best facilities, and I still couldn't save him. What does that make me? Human, Samuel said. Margaret looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Then she opened the car door and walked into the house without another word. That evening, Samuel received a text from an unknown number. It was Arthur. She asked me to give you this. Bring Grace tomorrow if you'd like. Samuel stared at the message. Then he looked across the room where Grace sat, drawing another picture of an empty house. Something in his chest shifted. The next morning, Grace came with him. She sat in the front seat wrapped in her jacket, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that had belonged to Laura. When Margaret entered the car, she saw Grace and something flickered across her face. Surprise, yes, but also something like relief. They drove to the hospital. Margaret stared at the entrance, but her eyes kept drifting to Grace. After 15 minutes, she spoke. What are you drawing? Grace looked down at the notepad in her lap. She'd been sketching during the drive. She held it up without speaking. It was a picture of the car, the black sedan with 3 people inside. Margaret's breath caught. It's beautiful. Grace lowered the paper and returned to her drawing, but Samuel saw it. The smallest smile at the corner of her daughter's mouth, the first he'd seen in months. At the law office, Margaret returned to the car faster than usual. She slid into her seat and looked at Grace. I had a son, Margaret said quietly. He liked to draw too. Houses mostly. Buildings he wanted to design. Grace turned in her seat, looking back at Margaret for the first time. She didn't speak, but she listened. He was sick, Margaret continued. Not the kind of sick that doctors can fix easily. The kind that lives in your mind and makes you forget who you are. Grace's eyes were wide and serious. Samuel watched them in the mirror, these 2 broken people finding each other in the space between words. At the foundation, Margaret got out of the car and stood staring at the concrete. Then she turned back and opened Grace's door. Would you like to see? Grace looked at Samuel. He nodded. She climbed out and took Margaret's hand. Samuel watched them walk to the edge of the foundation. Margaret knelt beside Grace and pointed at the empty space, explaining something Samuel couldn't hear. Grace listened, her small hands still in Margaret's, and for a moment they looked like what they were, 2 people trying to make sense of absence. When they returned to the car, Grace's face was thoughtful. Margaret's was softer. At the bank, Margaret was in and out quickly. On the drive home, she asked Grace, Do you like ice cream? Grace nodded. They stopped at a small shop on the way back. Margaret bought 3 cones, vanilla for Grace, chocolate for Samuel, strawberry for herself. They ate in the car, the first time Margaret had ever deviated from the routine. Grace licked her cone carefully, watching Margaret. When they arrived at the mansion, Margaret said, "Come inside." It wasn't a request. It was an invitation. Inside, Arthur made tea. They sat in the conservatory, a room Samuel had never seen before, glass walls, plants everywhere, sunlight filtering through. Grace drew at the table while Margaret and Samuel talked. Not about grief, not about loss, about simple things. The weather, the garden, Grace's school. It felt normal. It felt like the beginning of something. From that day, Grace came every day after school. The routine changed. The 4 stops remained, but now Grace joined them sometimes. Margaret began to speak more, about Michael, about her life before, about the empire she'd built and the cost it had taken. Samuel shared stories about Laura, about the good days before the cancer. Grace listened to all of it, and slowly, her silence began to crack. She started speaking in small ways, a word here, a sentence there. First to Margaret, then to Samuel. The mansion, once a place of ghosts, began to feel like home. One evening, as they sat in the conservatory, Grace asked Margaret, "Why do you go to those places every day?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "To remember. To punish myself. To try and make sense of what I lost." Grace thought about that. "Draw it," she said. "Draw Michael." Margaret hadn't drawn since she was a child. But she picked up a pencil and tried. The sketch was rough, imperfect, a young man with kind eyes and a sad smile. Grace added to it, a house in the background, light in the windows. Margaret stared at the drawing. Tears fell then, the first Samuel had seen her cry. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall. After that, the trips to the 4 places became less rigid. Sometimes they skipped one. Sometimes they talked during the waits. Margaret began to heal, piece by piece. Samuel did too. And Grace. Grace became a child again, full of words and laughter and questions. 3 months after Samuel took the job, Margaret asked him to drive her to a new location. The Riverside neighborhood, a cluster of old apartment buildings slated for demolition. Whitmore Developments was planning to build luxury condos there. They walked through the streets, Margaret in her suit, Samuel and Grace beside her. People stared, whispered. Margaret stopped at one building, knocked on a door. An elderly woman answered. Mrs. Patterson, who had cared for Grace when Laura was sick. Margaret introduced herself. "I'm here to learn about Riverside," she said. "About the people who live here." They spent the day talking to families, hearing stories of struggle and community. That night, Margaret sat at her desk with plans and reports. "I'm canceling the project," she said to Samuel. "I'm going to build affordable housing instead. Use Michael's designs. The board will fight you. I know. But it's time to build something that matters." The next morning, they drove to the headquarters. The board meeting was tense. Margaret presented her case, not with numbers, but with stories. With Grace's drawing of a house with light. The board voted. It was close, but they approved. Riverside would be saved. In the months that followed, the mansion became a hub for the project. Families came for meetings. Children played in the garden. Grace made friends. Margaret and Samuel grew closer, not in a romantic way, but as partners in healing. They became family, the kind built from shared pain and chosen love. 1 year after Samuel took the job nobody wanted, he stood in the completed Riverside community. Houses built from Michael's designs, beautiful, affordable, full of light. Grace ran through the central garden, laughing with other children. Margaret stood beside him, watching. "Thank you," she said. "For driving. For staying. For showing me how to live again." Samuel smiled. "Thank you for the job. It turned out to be the best decision of my life." And as they walked toward Grace, toward the light, Samuel knew that sometimes the jobs nobody wants are the ones that save you. The ones that remind you that broken things can be mended, With time, with patience, with unexpected grace.